Okay, so here's what's happening is that the things that you learned on campus and what Nate talked about the last time is the two words that came up from our conversation, our initial conversation with Parker was he was asking some questions. It feels like I'm making a transition, and then also the things that I learned on campus, as I look forward to using them in the marketplace, I have to translate those principles and skills. So we're talking about transition and translation. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Truth never changes, but where people are in relationship to it does. So from here, especially after lunch, we're going to really talk about some of these skill sets. And we already talked about what it looks like to think in terms of a crock pot as opposed to a microwave. And so in a sense, what's going to happen is things are going to kind of slow down, sort of, but life kind of picks up anyway. But I can understand that it's for a 22, 23-year-old coming off a college campus that has been moving at the speed that you have, you know, there's, in a sense, it's like I want to see things happen, you know, a lot faster. Let me have you write this down, and I'm going to give you a little list later, some other books that are helpful, but read this book. This is the best book that I've ever read on the 20s. It was written by two students here at the University of Missouri, and when they became 20 years old, they started a journal, and they journaled every day for the 10 years in their 20s. And then when they got done, they got together and they wrote a book. And the name of the book is 20-Someone, Finding Yourself in the Decade of Transition. It's excellent because what happens is the pressure they felt, the authors are Craig Dunham and Doug Servin. And after they were in college, they went to work for the Navigators. Craig Dunham became Jack McQueen's right-hand man and ran Eagle Lake for about 10 or 12 years. Doug was the NAV staff at Oklahoma State. And they just absolutely tremendous men, and they really captured this concept. But the idea is they felt pressure when they got into the 20s, was that everybody said, what is it you're going to do? And their idea is the 20s is figuring out also who I am. And so they take everything that they learned on campus, and I apologize because they were here and they learned it from me. And so now they're having to go back and say, well, let me try to figure out what it was that he was saying. But they've done the best job. And for a number of years, it was used widely on campus in the NAVs, but then somewhere along the line I was talking to Nate, and Nate said he'd never heard about it. So sometimes what happens is it doesn't get passed down. So had I been thinking, I would have gotten you all a copy, but I apologize that I didn't do that. But Craig Dunham and Doug Servin have written a fantastic book, so I'd encourage you to take a look into that. All right, module number 4, protecting your first love, Jesus. I can remember the exact place that I was when a gentleman that was sitting across from me gave an answer that sent a chill down my spine. This gentleman had been an assistant pastor at a large church here in Columbia. When he was in college, he was with an organization, and he was the president of that organization. He was a phenomenal leader, a phenomenal organizer, and he was working at this church after law school, and he was in charge of small groups, and he could do it. I mean, it was organized, it was sliced, it was diced. But the amazing thing is there was something that was a little out of sorts. It's like going through the motions, but something was flat. And in kind of the way that he related to people sometimes came across that. So I had a kind of a relationship with that church as a consultant, and so they asked me if I would sit down with this gentleman, and he was willing to do so. And so we began to interact, and it's kind of like a mechanic seeing a car that doesn't work right, but they can't put their finger on it. So after a number of months, I looked at the gentleman and I said, I don't know. I mean, I see what I see, I hear what I hear, but I can't quite put my finger on it. So I said, can you help me out? Can you help me figure out what do you think is the issue that we're dealing with? Because I can't seem to get a grip on it. And he says, well, Larry, he says, yes, in fact, I can. He says, I don't know if I've ever told anybody this before, but this might be what you're looking for. He said, I love the ministry more than I love Jesus. And I'm just sitting there and I'm telling you what. I go, what did you say? And it was the most matter-of-fact response, but it was dead authentic and dead honest. Well, that sent us in a new direction, but it also caused me to begin to think, do I reflect the same things, or do other people? So our module 4 is protecting our first love of Jesus. And let's turn in our Bibles to Revelations chapter 2. And it says in Revelations chapter 2, we're going to start in verse 1. And this is Jesus talking to the elders at the church of Ephesus. And he says this, Revelations 2, chapter 1. To the angel of the church in Ephesus write, the one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, the one who walks among the 7 golden lampstands, says this, I know your deeds, and your toil, and your perseverance, and that you cannot endure evil men, and you put to test those who call themselves apostles, and they are not. And you found them to be false, and you have perseverance and have endured for my name's sake, and have not grown weary. Commendable things. And what happens is when we get involved in ministering to others, we get engaged in doing some of these very same things. And those are all good things. But in verse 4, this is what Jesus says, but I have this against you, that you have left your first love. So what I'd like to suggest is that those of us that love people and are willing to come alongside other people to share our life in the Word with them in a relevant and authentic manner, that we would not leave our first love, because otherwise we could certainly be a characteristic of the audience in Revelations chapter 2. So what I'd like you to do is to take that sheet of paper that I gave you and John 15, and I'd like you to read it at your table, out loud at your table. So now the other guys at the other tables are going to be reading the same thing. So use your kind of inside table voice type of deal. But as you go through, every time the word fruit is used, I'd like you to underline it. Every time that the word abide is used, circle it. So let's just read John 15, 1 to 17, and underline the word fruit. Now count up the number of times that fruit is used, and count up the number of times that abide is used. All right, how many fruits we got? 8 fruits. And how many abides? 10 abides. So I think that it would be safe. I'm not sure what it was said, but I'll let that one fly by. So in this passage, I think that it would be correct to say that this passage talks about abiding and bearing fruit. And so it's amazing to me that I believe this idea of not allowing us to leave our first love might have something to do with this correlation and this relationship between in John 15. And so what we see here is that Jesus clearly says, I am the vine. It's very important because it clarifies for me that I am not the vine, okay? But when I'm interacting with other people and you're engaged with other people, sometimes other people don't see the distinction. John 15 says, Jesus says, I'm the vine and you're the branch. So I need to understand clearly my identity and what my relationship is. If a lot of people come to me and tell me how beneficial it is for me to spend time with them, to coach them, come alongside, I can start thinking that I'm the vine. But it's interesting because the vine is the catalyst, the branch is just a conduit. And so what happens is the nourishment, the support, the identity, everything comes from the vine. And so the fact of the matter is I have to decide what is my focus going to be. And as you started to walk with God and learn, the focus always is the abiding. That's it, the abiding. And what happens is when we abide with Jesus, we begin to bear fruit. Now, there's a temptation, and sometimes it's to be able to make the fruit the focus. For myself and for many others, I've seen that sometimes if the fruit is my focus, I put at risk or secondary the abiding. Make sense? So, I think it would be we can say is that the focus is abiding and bearing fruit is the expected result. I heard somebody say one time, and this isn't original, but I don't know exactly who started it, so it's an unknown source. And I thought, when I first heard it, I thought, this is interesting. And then the more I grew and was engaged in ministry, I thought, wow, this is insightful. And then what happens is I've realized then it became incriminating because I was doing exactly what this statement said. And the statement is this: if our output exceeds our input, then our upkeep will be our downfall. And it's amazing to me as I've talked with people, great guys, gifted, extremely fruitful, and then later on, over time, it all fell apart. And it's amazing because what happens is they got focusing on the fruit and made this secondary. And then what happens is when that bough breaks, no longer does it bear any fruit. So my encouragement to myself and to you is to be men who desire to be lifelong laborers, to be able to protect our first love of Jesus. Psalm 27:4 says, David says, one thing I've asked from the Lord that I shall seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to meditate in his temple. Abiding has to do with becoming like Christ, spending time with him. You've heard it said that you become like those that you hang around. I was speaking to a group of pastors here a few months ago, and we were talking about making disciples who make disciples. And the interesting question was, what exactly is a disciple? And so as they articulated those different things for me, and they were great paragraphs and everything else, I asked them, could you give me the permission to find out what Jesus says a disciple is? Most of the pastors said, gosh, I should have thought of that myself. So if you would turn to the next page, we're going to take a look, and this is what Jesus says are the marks of a disciple. So a person that abides with Christ, with that relationship, us allowing him to be our first love, I would suggest that abiding relationship in an ever-growing fashion would allow us to reflect these marks of a disciple. So the first one is this, whole life transformation. In Luke 6 and in Matthew 10, it says, a pupil is not above his teacher, but everyone after he has been fully trained will be like his teacher. A disciple is one who identifies with Christ, whose life is being transformed to share his character, values, purpose, and destiny. All right, so one of the characteristics is this idea of becoming like Christ in our character, attitudes, choices, and relationships. Let's take a look at a second mark there in sacrificial allegiance. Who'd like to read that? Go ahead.
You want the verse or the...
Both, please, yeah.
If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Luke 14:26. A disciple is one who consistently and habitually submits to the authority and leadership of Christ, choosing his kingdom over self-interest.
Okay, great. Next one, faithful obedience.
I got it. So Jesus was saying to those Jews who had believed in him, if you continue in my word, then you are truly disciples of mine, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. A disciple is one who makes the scripture the final authority for all of life, to know his truth, obey his commands, and live by a biblical worldview.
Excellent. One little comment I have on this is that as we look at these and want to be able to grow and abide with Christ in these areas, in working with men, the number one issue, bar none, nothing else is close, that men deal with in terms of following Christ is consistency in the Word. And it's amazing. And sometimes it's because they don't have the heart. Sometimes people haven't asked about the how-tos. But somewhere along the line, there's been hindrances, but it's never become a habit. And so I think that one of the things that we pray for is that men would have a heart for the Word and to get into the Word. And the Word of God and the Spirit of God transforms the person, in an amazing way. People ask me, how come that's so difficult? Mark 4:19 says this, the worries of the world and the deceitfulness of riches and the desires for other things, they choke the Word. It's in the passage of fruitfulness, but it's the choking of the Word that causes unfruitfulness. So just kind of a highlight there for yourself and for myself to make a priority on being consistent in the Word. 1 Peter 2:2 says, like newborn babes, long for the pure milk of the Word, that by it you may grow in respect to salvation. So the Word is to our spiritual life like food is to the physical. And so if we were to ask ourselves, what would we look like if we don't eat, then the same thing would be true spiritually. So this idea of being able to be consistent in the Word is one of the characteristics of a disciple. Okay, servant love.
I got it. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. John 13:31-35.
Okay. And spiritual fruitfulness. Go ahead.
My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. John 15:8.
Okay. And what Jesus does is he brings out these character qualities. So as we begin to abide and spend time with him, the word abide means being at home at. It's to experience the presence of God. It's to sit at his feet and listen to his word. In a sense, what happens is this is what kind of comes out. The character, the attitudes, the choices, the relationships. And so it's really interesting because what happens is, it just really takes humility, because as we abide and our focus is the abiding, our expected result is the bearing fruit, we can really give God the glory and the credit and rejoice in that. And what happens is we get to be able to see the abiding relationship. As I mentioned before, next week I come to the end of my 40th year with the Navigators. It's been a great ride. I'm grateful for the organization. I look forward to continuing. Maybe not as long as Jim Downing, but for a long time. But I've got to tell you that the satisfaction and the fulfillment comes from a relationship with Christ and having Jesus be the first love. And without that, without guarding our first love, the ministry, regardless of the amount of fruit, will never satisfy. I was walking into the doctor one day, and the nurse came and got me, and she said, "Well, before you see the doctor, I'd like to take your vital signs." I said, "How come?" And she looked at me and she goes, "Nobody's ever asked me that question before." I said, "Well, I don't know. I just thought I'd ask the question." She says, vital signs are kind of an indicator that kind of help us with a baseline to be able to figure out if there might be a potential problem coming along, or it might explain something when you go to see the doctor. And I said, "Okay, well, what are the vital signs?" And she says, "Well, basically, we take your pulse, we check your height, your weight." I said, "Can I do without that one?" She goes, "No, get on the scale." And, and then we take the blood pressure. And there were a couple other in there also. And I said, "Well, what do you do with those vital signs?" And she says, "Well, we keep them on record, and we begin to track those things." And I said, "Well, why do they call them vital?" She says, "Because they're vital." And so she says, "Would you just do it?" So anyway, I agreed to just do it. But as I left there after seeing the doctor, I thought, isn't that interesting? I wonder what my spiritual vital signs are. And so I have just found the benefit of being able to say, in light of these marks of a disciple, at this point in my life, what are the vital signs that I need to kind of track? Not to say that they do me, I'm not performing or trying to get any bonus points, but what I want to do is I just want to be able to, for my health, for my spiritual health, and for my spiritual maturity. So one of the things that I would invite you guys to consider is what are your vital signs? Sometimes it's kind of foggy, and you come off the campus and you've been engaged in, scripture memory, Bible study, time in the Word, solitude, different things. But now part of one of the things that happens in this translation or transition time is Paul says an interesting thing to Timothy. He says, "You, however, continue in the things that you've learned and become convinced of." Part of the transition time is having been exposed to things, but it's also now taking those things that you've become convinced of. And then what happens is you make them your own. In reality, until they become your own, you can't give them away anyway. But part of it is this idea of the spiritual vital signs. And so it's interesting for me, mine has to do with consistency in the Word. It has to do with, one of the intakes for me is scripture memory. It has to do with prayer and a couple of other things. And one of the things, and we'll talk about this later, is just purity of life. I have to be in a position where I'm voluntarily accountable to somebody else in the area of purity of life. So I have a couple of vital signs. And some of the guys on our team here, they have their vital signs. But what we're saying is, what has to happen and what can you track in your attitudes, in your character, to be able to say, I want to allow Jesus to be my first love. One thing that I find that's really helpful for me is just this idea of a triad. And the triad comes from this idea of a tripod. It's interesting because Nate was talking about video games and everything else, and a lot of you guys are in, technology, and it's amazing because I did a little research and tried to ask the question, when were tripods made? And it goes back, thousands and thousands of years. Somebody figured out that having 3 legs provided some stability. And it's amazing because what are some of the things that we put on tripods to be able to have stability? Cameras.
Stools.
Pardon me?
Stools.
Stools. You can put a stool on a tripod. You,
Three-legged stool.
three-legged stool. You can put, it can be an easel to hold a picture or a painting. It can be in the military to be able to stabilize, a firearm. It can be used in a surveying tool to be able to put that on, but it's amazing. The question is I think one of the things that helps us in abiding is creating our own triad. And this idea of the triad having somebody who is our mentor, someone who we have a relationship with, and someone who can kind of come alongside us and speak into our life. And what's interesting is you probably had that in college, and as you transition into the marketplace, it's absolutely important to have a mentor. Oftentimes it's the person who helped before. It's like in a relay race. We don't want the baton to drop on the track. We also want to have somebody, some peers, buddies. It's interesting to see how you guys, when you came in, how you related. Some said hi, some shook hands, some hugged. The idea was, what's the norm? Well, a lot of it has to do with how well you know one another, what campus you're from, and the time you spent together. And then there's this idea of a protege and who we're passing this on to. It's amazing to see that if this is us, the stability that we can have by building in those relationships from a spiritual standpoint. These are people that you can't buy at Walmart. These are people that if you don't have one of those, it creates instability. So I believe that one of the things that we can do in terms of having Jesus as our first love is be able to have men who come alongside us who share that value. To be able to have guys that look out for us, to be able to say, hey, there's somebody that's watching out for my soul. And then the third one is to be able to say, who is somebody that's coming behind us that we can impart those things to? So to protect our first love, I think we have to look at the idea that our output can't exceed our input, otherwise our upkeep will be our downfall. And the idea of being able to say, what are those qualities that I can gain from abiding with the vine? And it's not to devalue the fruit or the ministry, but it's to being able to say, my focus is the abiding and my expected result is the fruit. So what I'd like you to do in the 10 minutes that we have remaining is if you could answer these two questions just at this point in your spiritual journey, what would you identify as your spiritual vital signs? And then secondly, looking at your spiritual triad, who are the current people that fill those roles? So let's take the next 10 minutes and work on those two questions, please.